Let's talk Canada.
So Canada has 5 problems that you have to take into account because all of them affect real estate. The first one is geographic and political. The population is stretched out, basically hugging the American border for warmth. And because of the way that Canada was formed as a codominium of Anglos in Ontario and Quebecois in Quebec, you have made the decision very early on in your process that the provinces have immense power vis-a-vis the central government. That means you didn't get your first trade deal until about 3 years ago. When I say trade deal, not with another country, within Canada. So internal barriers to trade remain immense, and almost every province in the Canadian system, as this graphic shows, has a greater an economic relationship south with the United States than it does with their own co-nationals. And in that sort of environment, Canada is always going to be incredibly exposed to international trends, especially as involves the elephant next door. Now, you fast forward 10 years, you do away with provincial autonomy somehow, that changes. I don't think that's going to happen in 10 years. Problem number 2 is strategic. This is a Cold War map. All the dots are where the Russians had their military bases. During the Cold War, Canada was in a privileged position. Now, the United States had created globalization in order to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. And whenever we tried to get a trade relationship with other countries, we always had to give in a little bit because we got full security control as a result. That was the guns for butter trade that defined the Cold War and American strategic policy. Now, Canada, because it's on the flight path for the missiles from the Soviet Union to the United States, could have been a security free rider. You could have been neutral. To your credit, you chose not to. In fact, to your credit, the Canadians were always the first ones for any fight. If they saw a crisis in the world, they'd pick up the phone, they'd call the president, and the first words the Canadian Prime Minister always said is, "We see what's happening, we're here, how can we help?" And that made Canada our fastest friend. But you weren't dumb about it. The next words out of the Canadians' mouth after all the security details were worked out, be like, "We would really appreciate a little bit more market access for Quebecois cheese or Ontarian spark plugs or whatever it happened to be, softwood timber, if you will." On over 70 different occasions, Canada carved little melon scoop exemptions out of American trade law. And all of those were folded into NAFTA 1. And that's how things lasted until this guy came along. We've been moving away from the globalist approach in the United States for some time, but Donald Trump was the first one to make it the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And he loved Trudeau because Trudeau was perceived around the world as the only world leader that Donald Trump was smarter than. With that in his back pocket, Trump played hardball on trade negotiations, and all of those exemptions that Canada had spent 40 years building into American trade law were jettisoned in the NAFTA 2 discussions. The only reason that there's even an adjudication function in there isn't because of Canada, it's because Nancy Pelosi put it in at the last second within the US House. Now, as we all know, Justin Trudeau is not the brainchild that is running Canada. That would be Christina Freeland. And at the time that Trump became president, she was your trade negotiator and ultimately your foreign minister. And she attempted to play the old playbook in the NAFTA negotiations. The idea that Canada has a special place in American trade law and it's justified in getting its exemptions. And I'm not saying this to denigrate her. I think she's one of the smartest people on the planet right now. But her first week on the job was Trump's first week on the job. And she was handed a playbook that became obsolete the day she took her office. And so she was pushing for things into NAFTA 2 that the United States had no interest in, on labor, on environmental regulations. And at the end of the day, the Americans got sick of it and cut a bilateral deal with the Mexicans to cut Canada out of NAFTA completely. And this is the photo from the stage when she found out. The Mexican and the American negotiators didn't tell her ahead of time. And after this meeting, she was simply told, the United States is going to proceed with this in 8 days with the Mexicans. You have 8 days to accept the original terms. If you don't, fine, you're on your own. 7 days later, Justin Trudeau signed, and we got NAFTA too. Problem number 3, geography. What you're looking at here is not a population density map. It is a spatial expansion map. So cities that are in green or blue are not very physically constrained. They can expand in almost all directions. That keeps development costs low. Cities that are in red and orange have difficulty. Maybe they have an ocean or a mountain or a national park or some sort of protected wetlands or something. They can't physically expand very easily, and so their internal land costs tend to be very high. That makes for expensive housing. We've got 3 trends that are going on in Anglo-America right now, same on both sides of the border. Number 1, because of COVID, not a lot of people want to be reliant on public transport. Cities with a circle can't function without city transport, so people are moving out. Number 2, the baby boomers on both sides of the border want to move somewhere warm. They don't want to shovel snow in February. They're moving south, or in the case of Canada, west. And then third, the millennials are coming of age. They're raising families, and they want to be in a place where they can have a backyard. They have to move to a place where land costs are lower. So we're seeing people moving out of the coastal cities, and that's on both sides of the border, into the interior, specifically in the American South, Southwest, and West. You guys don't have a lot of room. I know that Canada is a freaking huge country, but if you start preferencing away from Vancouver and Montreal and Toronto, there aren't a lot of other options. And so you're seeing significant distortions across your entire labor structure. Fourth, demographics. Here's your provincial demographics as of a couple of years ago. You'll notice a couple things about Ontario, Quebec, and BC. You guys have, for the most part, stopped having kids a while ago. You are rapidly aging. Not into obsolescence, we're not there yet. But in this decade, that big bulge of people in their 50s will have moved into their 60s. And then the economic case for the 3 biggest Canadian provinces gets very, very difficult, because you're going to have to tax your young people in order to support your retirees. And if the taxes get too high and the services get too low for the young people, they will relocate. Alberta to this point has been a bit of an exception because of the oil boom. It has drawn people in from the other provinces, especially people in their 20s and 30s who are still going to have kids. And that makes Alberta your youngest demographic structure in the entire country. But the housing stock that you have in the rest of the country is not necessarily appropriate for the way your demographic structure is evolving, except, again, possibly in Alberta. And that mismatch in an environment of capital shortages, in an environment when we need to double the size of the industrial plant, means that there's a contest for every single dollar that is available for investment. Do you put it into industrial plant? Do you put it into infrastructure? Do you put it into training? Do you put it into housing? You're going to have to choose.
So what is it about Alberta that makes its housing stock set up the best for demographics and for immigration?
Sure, the tar sands boom really got going about 15 years ago. And in the first year, the Albertans were attracting people from all over Canada, with a heavy emphasis, of course, on the Maritimes, because the economic dislocations there have been pretty rough. But most of the people who were coming were in their 20s. And that meant they were mostly men. And within a couple of years, it became apparent that Calgary really needed to recruit a wider array of people in order so that these people were not doing what happens in the United States and just living in man camps. And so the decision was made early on to put a lot of effort into building larger apartments and single family homes, so that these young men who were coming in could actually have a reason to bring someone with them, maybe bring kids with them. And then the expansion of the economy within Calgary itself attracted a lot of women from all parts of Canada in order to do the non-oil jobs. And all of a sudden, you've got people from BC and people from Nova Scotia falling in love in Calgary and buying a single-family home. And it's the one place in Canada where most of the housing construction was not catering to foreigners. So it wasn't just condos. It was actually people who wanted yards. And that made for a very, very different property market in Alberta compared to everywhere else.
Interesting.
Now, to this point, Canada has always had a trump card: immigration. As long as you are bringing in people in their 20s and their 30s and their early 40s, people have already finished their primary and secondary education somewhere else, so you don't have to pay for it. But then they come in and they work for 30 or 40 years before they retire. You have been able to function on a bit of a treadmill. The people who come in, as long as they're young enough, have enough time to pay into the system to then pay for their own retirement. But if they don't come in until they're in their 40s, they will never pay in enough to justify the budgetary expense that it takes. Until recently, this is just barely held up. But what has happened under COVID is the input pipeline has stopped. In addition, the nature of immigration that you've attracted in the last years has been dramatically different from what's come before. It's no longer people who are coming to work and live forever. It's people who come and drop some money, maybe establish residency, but don't actually work and then move on. And they use their financial assets to buy physical assets in Canada, primarily real estate, that they then do not live in. And because they're either fleeing the European financial crisis or the Chinese breakdown, they're relatively cost insensitive when they're evaluating property. Because from their point of view, if 10, 15 years from now, the property is only worth half what they paid for it, for them that's still a win, because it means they got half their money out of a dying system. That has been your primary investment portfolio for the last few years. And that means that most economic activity in some of your provinces has been real estate based, upwards of 30, 40% in BC specifically. And a lot of the Canadian provinces are getting 3, 4% of their tax intake from nothing more than transferring titles from one real estate owner to another. That treadmill is now breaking down. Two things. Number one, the world is opening up a little bit more. And so there's a different class of people that's looking to leave as these other systems really approach the brink. They're older, they have more money. So all the distorting things that we've been talking about here are going to get worse. And second, because so many foreigners have bought so much property in so many gateway cities in Canada, a lot of Canadians cannot afford to live in their own country anymore. That has a political impact. And so the Trudeau government, effective January 1, has put restrictions on the ability of foreigners to own real estate. So how will this all shake out? Way too soon to tell. The ban's only been in place for a week and a half. And it's going to change the nature of who's coming to Canada. And we're already feeling that pressure south of the border as some of it diverts. As a rule, all else being equal, most foreigners would rather be in Canada than the United States. It's considered more politically friendly. Or it was until January 1. And now the economic issue really, really, really matters. Deal with the last factor, the fifth one. What we're looking at here is American data again. The gray and the yellow is the same as that first slide. So that's net worth by decade. And that's everyone, that's average. The blue and the orange is median. So it removes the top and the bottom 1%. In the United States, half of all financial assets are held by the top 1%. And that means that in the United States, yes, we have a massive inequality issue. We're not going to solve that on a podcast. But it also means that when you retire, if you're in the top 1%, you don't have to liquidate your entire portfolio. You probably only liquidate a third or a half of it. And that leaves a significant amount of capital engaged. The challenge that Canada is going to face is it has a more traditional wealth distribution. So domestic capital is dropping significantly and will stay low for a very long time. That means imported capital is what's going to be driving it. The United States is going to be the source for most of that simply because of this disparity within our own economic equality on the south side of the border. And then third, you're going to have a lot of desperate, hungry, scared money from the wider world looking for a way to land in Canada in an environment of a real estate block. A lot of moving pieces that are going to require both the provinces and Ottawa to come up with different policies. What Trudeau has done on the first, it makes sense to me. Whether or not it's going to work, I do not know. But I know it's kind of only the opening gambit for the changes in policy that we should expect to see over the next several years. And if you play it wrong, the treadmill that keeps Canada functioning stops. And that, among other things, might mean that Canada is not able to participate in the reindustrialization of North America. Because if Canada can't draw those people in, it no longer has the workforce that is necessary to do the reindustrialization in the first place. So there's a lot of things that get tangled up here that Canada is going to have to assign values to and then muddle its way forward as we enter the most dynamic period in North American history since the War of 1812.